And the good news is none of this is easy. That may be, one could say that's the bad news, but you know what the good news is? The good news is if we start, there are really some wonderful things we could do to enhance resilience in our own lives as well as in others. And why, speaking in terms of the season of giving, as you'll hear, and it just really builds on what Gina said, what more and more research is showing, and I'll share with you some of my own, that one of the most important things in being resilient is when you feel you make a difference in the life of someone else. And I'm not talking about compassion fatigue. I'm talking about you make a difference. It really helps you to be resilient, and it benefits the other people as well. So let me start with the first one, thing is this. And if you go to, again, I'll mention my website. There are a number of articles on my website about what I call personal control. Resilient people, as it says here, resilient people focus on what they have control over. Some of you may see it says similar to the Serenity Prayer, and do not spend a lot of time on things over which they have little control. As I look back in my 40-year career as a therapist, I will tell you, there are so many unhappy people who are still waiting for their happiness by someone else changing first. I've done a fair bit of marital therapy. A couple came in once to see me. I actually said, so what will help the marriage? I always like to ask that. And the wife looked at me, looked at her husband, looked back at me, and I'm not even sure she truly appreciated what she was saying, said, I'd be in a good marriage if I wasn't married to him. I mean, think about that. I do a lot of work with schools, so a teacher said to me once, I would really be a good teacher if I didn't have students like this. Duh. But you know what? One of the worst, well, let me put this positive. No, I'll be truthful. I always like to ask people, like, tell me one or two of the best moments you've ever had in life or your job, and one or two of the worst moments. So I'll tell you, one of the toughest times was when I really went to work at McLean Hospital. My first job was as principal of the school in the locked door unit of the child and adolescent program. So what happens is, well, I burned out after a few weeks, but we'll talk about, that's why I got interested in resilience in adults as well. So what happens is a child or adolescent would be admitted, and the next day they came to my school. I would read the records. And you know what I would say? Dear Lord, I couldn't tell people this for a while, right? And what I said, oh, this is being streamed, so it's everywhere. Okay, I would say, dear Lord, why are we getting kids like this? There must be another program somewhere else in the world. Why here? I am principal of a school in a locked door unit of a psychiatric hospital. Who did I think was going to come in? Some sweet, passive kid knocking on the door saying, I've waited all my life to be locked up. Can you please take me? I mean, it's very interesting. But I want to mention a couple of, actually, I'm going to mention a few books as well. There's so much sadness when I speak to a 50-year-old and they're still moaning and groaning about, or holding a grudge from 30 years and still waiting for an apology. We have control over only one person in this world, and you know who that is? Ourselves. And by the way, I'll say this quietly, sometimes I even question that. Do we really? And it's very important. Just to give you a few examples, there are so many people who still have the attitude, why me? I've always been interested in both children and adults who struggle, with learning. And I still remember some of the research done by a psychologist, Paul Gerber. He looked at adults with learning disabilities who were doing very well in life. He looked at adults who were not doing very well in life. And he said, can I distinguish them? He looks at all these variables. You know what's the main thing? The adults who are doing very well in life long ago gave up the feeling, why did I have to be born with a learning disability? It's held me back. They gave that up, and instead, you know what they said? I had no control over being born with a learning disability. What I have control over is how I respond to it. One of the things I learned, many things happen in our lives we have no control over, but we do have control over our response and attitude towards things. The adults with learning disabilities who are doing poorly, they could be 55. You know what they were saying? 60 years old. Why did I have to be born this way? So they were constantly in a victim mentality. And my work as a therapist, if you ever talk to some of my patients, they would say, I know exactly what he's going to talk about. What do you have control over? Now, it's very interesting. I didn't know Gina was going to mention Christopher Reeve. I have an article on Christopher Reeve because he gave an interview, and I was stunned. You know, he said, when I became quadriplegic, at first I wondered why me, and then he said, I could still write, I could still direct, and he goes on and on. I could still help people. And I'm saying, what an amazing attitude. But then he said something else in this interview, which was incredible. He said, one of the things I've learned from what happened is paralysis is a choice. And I remember saying, what do you mean it's a choice? You fell off a horse and you're paralyzed. And he says something fascinating. He said, I know able-bodied people who are paralyzed. They always have a victim mentality. They do not help, and the notion, he was involved in spinal cord injury, but he was involved in environmental causes to his dying day. And he goes on and on, he said, you see, paralysis is a choice. And one of my all-time favorite books, which I will mention, have you ever read a book and say, I should reread it, but then you see the 60 books you haven't read yet? Has that ever happened to you? But for the 7th time this summer, I read this book. If you haven't read it, I would strongly recommend it. It's to this point. It's Viktor Frankl's book called Man's Search for Meaning. It is probably one of the most spiritual, meaningful books I ever read. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist whose whole family was wiped out in the Holocaust. He was in a concentration camp. The first half of the book is his experience in the concentration camp. The second half is about this fascinating form of therapy he developed called logo and meaning therapy. He has a quote in there. You'll see it. I almost know it verbatim, but I'll probably butcher it a little.